In this episode, I have a compilation of over 30 weird and strange encounters. But first, let's get started with a brand new encounter that happened just last week in West Virginia. Hi, Donovan. This happened just a week ago. My girlfriend and I were camping on her property. Her dad owns about 50 acres of land in West Virginia in the mountains. He built this beautiful small camp there on top of a mountain. It has all the amenities of a regular house because he spent a small fortune on it. We go up there multiple times a year, but this time it was just my girlfriend and I. We were up there for the weekend and everything was normal at first. We were enjoying our time together. We cooked food on the grill outside and watched some TV as it was raining the day we got up there. I went to bed early that night because I was pretty tired, but she stayed up watching TV until about midnight when she joined me in bed. It was about 5 a.m. when we were woken up by the sounds of something pounding on the outside of the cabin. I grabbed my shotgun, which I always keep right beside the bed, and looked out the window. I couldn't see anything, but the pounding noise wouldn't stop. We didn't have any of the outside lights on, so I went to the kitchen, and that's when I noticed that the sliding glass door was cracked right down the middle. I turned on the outside lights, and out there towards the back of the house were hundreds of these small creatures. They were black and had these long arms. They had the body of a monkey, but they had no face. It was the creepiest thing I ever saw, and there's hundreds of them out there. They all started to scatter when I turned on the light, but there were still dozens of them pounding against the side of the cabin. I didn't want to open any of the doors, so I grabbed a spotlight that they kept in the family room closet and I started shining it outside. They all started making this hissing noise and would run away from the light. So I just kept shining the light on them through different windows of the cabin until the sun came up about an hour later. As soon as the sun came up, they were all gone. Needless to say, we left that day and reported this to the Department of Natural Resources, but we haven't heard anything since. I have no idea what those creatures were, but they were scary as hell. Hi, Donovan. Let me just say I love your show and thanks for releasing every day. I had this encounter when I was hiking in Yosemite on August 10th of 2012. It was about noon when I got to the top of the trail and started walking down towards the backcountry site. There were a few other hikers on the trail, but not many. The weather was clear and sunny with a slight breeze. I was walking down the trail when I heard a noise that sounded like a large cat growling. It was a deep guttural sound that seemed to be coming from all around me. I stopped and looked around, but I didn't see anything. I started walking again, and then I heard the same sound again. This time it sounded like it was coming from up above me on the hillside. Again, I look around, but I didn't see anything. The third time this happened, it sounded like whatever it was had moved very close to me on my right side. At this point, I got freaked out and started running down the trail towards the backcountry site. When I got about halfway there, I stopped because I thought I could hear something moving through the brush near me. There were no other hikers on the trail at this point, so I started yelling out, "Hello, is anybody there?" I heard a few more noises, but then nothing else after that. When I got to the backcountry site, I told the rangers what had happened, and they said they hadn't heard anything. Anyway, I didn't see or hear anything else after that. The rangers told me that there was probably mountain lions in the area, and that's probably what I heard. I don't think it was a mountain lion because it had way more bass to it. It was terrifying to say the least. I've spent a lot of time outdoors, hiking and camping all over the country, and I've never heard anything like this before. It sounded like an animal, but one that was much larger than any cat that I've ever heard. Anyways, that's what happened. I didn't see anything, but whatever it was definitely came very close to me at least once. I'm not sure what it was, but I definitely felt threatened by it. Just wanted to share my experience with you. Thanks for your time. This happened in August of 2007 when I was 17 years old. I had gotten up early to go hiking with a friend of mine. and we were going to meet at the Trailhead around 6 a.m. So around 5:30, I left my house and I drove to the Trailhead, which is about 25 minutes away from where I live. When I got there, my friend hadn't arrived yet, so I decided just to sit in my car and wait for him. It was dark outside, but it was starting to get light so you could see fairly well inside the car. So after about 10 minutes of waiting in my car, a rustling noise caught my attention outside on the other side of the road, maybe 40 feet away. At first, I thought it might be a deer or something like that. Then this large creature comes walking out from behind the bushes on all fours. It looked kind of like a hyena, but much bigger. It had these really long hind legs that made its back look sort of hump-shaped when standing upright like it did when it walked across the road towards me. This thing freaked me out because its face looked almost human-like, except for its ears, which were very pointy and very long. It also had this very snub-nosed snout, and its fur was sort of reddish-brown in color with some white on it as well. This thing walked right up to my car window, which was still rolled down from when I've been waiting for my friend to show up. It stood there looking at me for about 20 seconds or so, sniffing the air like it was trying to smell me. Then it started making this weird noise sounding like a mix between a dog howling and a human screaming. It wasn't exactly human, but it wasn't exactly animal either. At that point, I freaked out because I thought this thing might try to break into my car or something. So I put the car in reverse and sped away from the area as fast as I could without crashing into anything. My friend showed up not too long after that happened. I saw him on my way out and stopped my car to talk to him. He was asking me why I was going in the opposite direction. I told him what had happened, and he didn't really believe me at first, but said he would go along with me just in case whatever it was came back. My name is Melissa, and I just wanted to first say thank you for giving me an outlet to share my encounter. My experience starts out like any other great adventure, as a summer trip to Silverwood Theme Park in North Idaho. I've been to Silverwood many times, and in planning a weekend for my birthday months ahead of time, I reserved a cabin at an area in a state park for 2 nights. I was able to reserve a beautiful cabin with a view of the lake and woods. My sister and I left the west side of Washington State in the wee hours and made a 5.5-hour road trip to Farragut State Park. We had a great day checking out the park. We walked some easy trails, hung out near the lake, and toured the on-site historic military museum. The visit to the museum is where the entire stay changed for both of us. As crazy as it may sound to some, I can feel, sometimes see, and always know much more than I have reason to. The museum, what they call the Brig, displays the history and daily life of this World War II naval training station. This is one of the last buildings standing of many, and is full of items from the time of the active military base. My sister and I walked through and had the tour of the building, being briefed on the history of the location and the memorabilia. What I can only describe as a shift in energy happened in the back of the building. I cannot recall, no matter how much I think back on that day, what exactly I was looking at when it happened. I do, however, remember the feeling. I got the chills and very much felt that it was time to go. Like right now. I nodded to my sister, who was looking at something else, and we went outside. She was oblivious and having a great time, but did mention that the statue out in front, a sculpture of a bust of a man, gave her the creeps. After we left the Brig, we went back to the cabin, and we ate our dinner, but both felt uneasy as the sun goes down and the wind picks up. We are staying in a dry cabin, and not having a restroom means a short walk to one just down the way, less than 50 yards away. I walk out of the door of the cabin just as it is getting dark, knowing it is only going to get darker. I very much want to hurry and get back into the warm bunk of the cabin. I start the short walk to the restroom that I can see from across the small parking lot area and field. As I get about halfway, I realize I'm being watched and stop and look up in the direction of the restroom. And just to the right, I will never forget what I saw. I had the same cold chill, the same go right now feeling. I saw a full body apparition of a soldier wearing only what I can describe as a dark button-up uniform and a flat style hat holding a rifle over his left shoulder. I stood and looked at this figure for what felt like an hour, but could have only been seconds. He was not a living being. He was a bit out of focus and not totally solid. I could not make out the definitive facial features and could actually see through him like you would see through a thick cloud of smoke. I broke my gaze and ran full sprint to the rest of the way to the bathroom, where I realize I'm totally alone. My cell has no signal. My sister by this time is totally unconscious and this thing is out there. After I get the nerve to exit the outhouse, it is darker outside, and I look around and I don't see anything. Thinking I was just paranoid or imagining things, I start back to the cabin feeling a little dumb. Again, I get to about the halfway point, and this time I hear a large crack and a thud. The sound a branch makes as it snaps off a tree and falls to the ground. I look in the direction of the sound, straight ahead and just past where I'm going, and the same figure is standing again, just in front of the trailhead near our cabin. This time he is more visible and more whole. I can make out his facial expression, and I get a feeling of him not being there to scare me. He has a slight smile and is somehow telling me to go inside and not to worry. Feeling shaken as I literally just seen a ghost, I try to make a call on my cell, only to find I have absolutely no signal. I go back into the cabin and have a very long night wide awake. I wake my sister up very early in the morning and I have already packed the car and I'm ready to leave. The reaction of the front desk lady when I checked out that morning still makes me wonder how often people leave this place early. I walked in looking more than a little frazzled and said, "We're checking out early." This woman took one look at me and asked hesitantly how our stay was. And I guess my facial expression was all the answer she needed. I noticed a full refund for the stay was issued days later, and my sister over breakfast listened to my story with wide eyes and amazement. Thanks for listening. I don't tell many people about these things, but I have so many experiences to share and find comfort in knowing that I'm not crazy or alone in them. Dear Donovan, below are the details I had experienced while living on the Yakama Reservation. These details are true and changed my life after. I'm trying my best to remember when this occurred, between 2003 or 2004. I had been working for a gravel company off and on for about 1 or 2 years. My second year I was promoted from working underneath a rock crusher, shoveling gravel and keeping the belts clear for the rock crushing machine. It was the dirtiest job, but it built character and humbled me deeply. The following year, in 2004, around late summer or early fall, my boss had obtained a job up in the mountains on my reservation. We were crushing rock and layering it over back roads for logging trucks. Timber is one of the main money makers for my tribe, aside from the Indian casino, aka Legends Casino. But back to the job. We started in Old Maids Canyon, and I had my shovel ready, but my boss told me to come with him and set the shovel down. I had been promoted to roller operator. Not only was I not working the dirtiest job I have ever worked, but my boss gave me a $2 raise for running the roller. It took me about a week to feel comfortable operating it on my own. I was on my own by day 2, but I stuck close to the rock crusher and trucks to get more familiar with the roller. About 3 weeks into this job, I had rolled ahead so far from the crushing site, I had rarely seen the trucks, meaning I was farther into the mountains on my own. I had a CD Walkman to listen to music and drone out the very loud roller. Deep into Old Maids Canyon, a truck had passed me and dumped the gravel. The backhoe came in and leveled it out, and now it was my turn to pack it down with the roller. The vibration was turned on, and I put the roller into gear to move forward. The truck and the backhoe were gone. With my headphones on and treating this like any other day of work, I was at least 5, maybe 6 miles away from the crushing site. The roller runs slow regardless, so I can't necessarily kick the sucker into fifth and run out of there in a hurry. I was in an area where the canyon and the tree line were butted up against the road I was rolling. The wind had picked up and blew in my direction. I had picked up the stench of something that seemed like rotted meat, and a really bad body odor. It literally made me want to vomit, the smell was so bad. I figured maybe a dead deer or elk nearby. I looked all around me and just realized just how enclosed I was in this area. Canyon and the trees surrounding me. To the left was a cliffside, slightly hidden by tall tamarack trees, but I could see rock from the cliffside through the trees. I took my headphones off. I pulled the roller over and shut it off. The smell had become so strong I knew I had to be pretty close to the dead animal or whatever was near the road. I heard rocks falling from the cliffs to the left of me, and I looked over there since it caught my attention. I also heard some grunting that was deep and muffled, like someone or something was trying to remain quiet, running up the hills of the cliffs. I gazed through the trees, and the wind picked up again, blowing the stench again towards me. And I realized if I can smell this thing, then it definitely smelled me, since I could hear something struggling to climb the cliffside. Through the branches, I caught sight of a patch of fur. Fur I had never seen before in my entire life. The fur and body it was attached to was orange and brown in color, and covered a very muscular back. People have told me I probably just saw a bear. My stepdad, who landed this job for me and drove truck for this company, even said it was a bear. But I know what I saw, and after spending years on my reservation, I heard stories of spilly-eye and Bigfoot which had been spotted by many on my reservation. This thing grunted and whooped once it reached the top. I saw a good portion of what it was. To my amazement and anxiety, it looked like a bipedal ape. The face had some fur over it, and even though this coat that covered its body was orange and brown, it had the snout of a coyote. Almost dog-like. It was like if Bigfoot and a dogman were to have spliced their genes and created an animal in their image. It would have looked like this. The body of a Bigfoot, it had to have been at least 8 or 9 feet tall. Its eyes were a sharp yellow color and almost glowed even though it was in the daylight. It ran away and out of sight. What happened in literally a few minutes had left a huge impact on me, realizing I'm alone and miles away from people and the crusher. I put the roller in reverse and backed the thing up, and started on my way back to the crushing site. The smell was gone. Everything seemed to return as it was before. No one believed what I saw. I tried to tell my coworkers and now my ex-stepdad. I never ventured far from the trucks after that. My stepdad left me with a pistol to keep on me just in case I came across a bear again. I think the reason people didn't want to believe me was because they didn't want to fear anything while working so far and deep in the mountains near Mount Adams. I believe I saw a trickster or spilly-eye, and it scared me to the point that I couldn't wait for this job in the mountains to be over. Once we laid gravel for all these logging roads, I never returned to this job. My mom and my stepdad ended up divorcing not long after. I was 24 years old at the time. The only person who believed me was my mom. Her brother, my uncle, had seen Sasquatch when he was young. My uncle, God rest his soul, had died tragically in a car accident when I was 9, and I never got to hear his story. But he saw Bigfoot. I never thought I'd come across something like this in my life. This is one of the craziest experiences that has ever happened to me. I believe that this creature had spared me that day. Instead of messing with me, it scurried away and grunted once at the top of the cliffs as if to say, "You're lucky I'm letting you go. Thank you for sharing my story." This happened in 2006 when I was training at what they call The Farm in Virginia. It's a facility run by the CIA, and it's used as a training facility for other agencies as well. I was in a small group of trainees, and we were all being led by our instructor on a nighttime navigation exercise. We had been out for about an hour or so when we came to this open field. The moon was very bright that night, and you could see pretty far across the field. As we crossed the field, our instructor stopped us and told us to be very quiet. He said he wanted us to listen to something that most people wouldn't believe if they heard it. So we stood there for a minute listening, but didn't hear anything at first. Then all of a sudden, I heard something coming from the tree line on the other side of the field. It sounded like it was walking, but it also made sounds like no animal I've ever heard before. This thing sounded massive. At first, some of the guys thought it might be a bear, but there's no bears in Virginia that are that big. After hearing this thing get closer, our instructor whispered for us to follow him, and he led us back through these trees into a wooded area. We went through this very heavy steel door and spiraled up 3 flights of stairs and came out on this overlook where we could see the field below. Our instructor told us to be quiet and watch and listen. I'll never forget what happened next. This thing came out into the field and stood right in the middle of it. It was huge. I'm not sure how tall it was, but I'd say at least 8 or 9 feet. It had dark gray fur all over its body, except for its face, which was this lighter gray. Its arms were really long, and it looked like it had no neck. Its head looked like a dog's head, but much bigger. The ears were very large, and they were pointed upwards. The craziest thing is that it was standing on its hind legs. This thing stood there for a few minutes looking around and started making sounds that sounded like some type of call. It would make this call and then pause for a second, then run to another spot in the field and make another call. After watching this thing do this several times, it went down on all 4s and took off across the field. That's when our instructor told us to follow him back down the stairs and that we were going back to the compound. He said there was no need in us staying out there any longer. I'll never forget what I saw that night. He didn't answer many questions about what we saw. However, he wanted us to know that this thing was real and that it was out there. I feel like they had it controlled somehow. How could he have known it was going to be there? That entire experience was just so bizarre. Like I said before, feel free to share, but no need to respond. Hi Donovan, thanks for sharing the great content. I had a weird encounter when I was doing a training exercise in the Everglades in Florida. I was part of a small group of people who were training dogs to track and find humans. We were out in the Everglades at night. It was around 10 p.m. or so. We had 3 dogs with us, all tracking dogs, and they were doing great. They would track the human scent we put down for them and follow it for miles until they got tired and needed a rest. So we are out there on this huge swatch of land that is surrounded by water on all sides except for one. And it's very dark out there, so we have spotlights on our vehicles as well as headlamps on our heads. We're driving around looking for good spots to set up our next training exercise when my driver says, "Hey man, look at that." I look over to where he's pointing and I see a bright light in the distance. It's not a car light or anything like that. It's bright white and almost seems to pulsate. We keep driving towards it, and as we get closer, I realize that what I thought was one light is actually 2 lights side by side. They are very bright and seem to be moving up and down in sync with each other. We get even closer now, and I can tell it's some sort of craft because you can see the outline of it against the night sky. It's triangular in shape with 3 lights on either corner. They are pulsating up and down slowly. We stop our car now because we want to get out and get a better look at this thing. Maybe try and figure out what it is doing here. We turn off all our spotlights so we can see it more clearly. We're pretty far away from this thing, but it's still massive compared to us. Probably about 50 yards long, if not more. It looks like it's hovering just above the water level. You can tell because you can see the water underneath it reflecting back up. It looks like it has a glass or clear material on the bottom so you can see through it. We are all standing there staring at this thing when this very weird vibration starts pulsating through our bodies. Kind of like how you can feel the bass go through you at a rock concert. Then this thing dimmed its lights and took off like a rocket. We were all pretty freaked out. I don't know what that thing was, but it wasn't from this planet. I've been in the military for over 10 years now, and I've never seen anything like that before or since. It was completely alien to me, no pun intended. But I had this weird feeling afterwards like someone was watching us. It almost felt like we were being followed or watched after that night. Not sure if it was just my imagination though. I received this account from a man who wishes to remain anonymous due to his current occupation with the military community. This happened in 2002 while I was doing a tour over in Afghanistan. I was on security patrol in the Helmand province. We were traveling down a dirt road that ran along a river. It was night and we had our headlights on. The road ran through a heavily treed area with high grass on either side of the road. We came around a bend in the road when my driver slammed on the brakes and yelled, "What is that?" I looked over to see what he was talking about and saw this huge black wolf creature standing beside the road. It stood at least 3 feet taller than the grasses, which put it at least at 6 or 7 feet tall. Its back was towards us, so I could not see its entire face, but its body appeared to be very muscular and built like a greyhound, but only much larger in size. The fur was jet black and very smooth looking. As we sat there staring at this thing, it turned slightly towards us, then took one step into the field where it stood perfectly still for about 30 seconds. It then took another step forward towards us, leaving this enormous footprint. Then it took one more step, which brought it directly in front of our headlights, where we got our first good look at its face up close and personal. This is when I nearly crapped myself. The face was so hideous that it was hard to describe. It looked like a cross between a dog and a human, but not exactly either one. The eyes were large and very dark in color, and the nose was more of a snout with these large nostrils that flared out when it sniffed in the air. The mouth was wide with these huge canines that were bared at us in an angry manner. I could see its throat working as if it were trying to swallow something, but there was nothing there. Its head appeared slightly larger than normal for its body, which made me wonder if it had a humped back or something. This thing stood there glaring at us for what seemed like an eternity before turning and running across the field with an incredible speed. We sat there in complete silence for several minutes before either one of us could find any courage to speak. When I finally spoke up, my driver told me that he had seen the exact same thing as what I had seen. He said he thought at first it might have been some kind of demon from hell. Needless to say, we got the hell out of there as fast as possible. We did not tell anyone about this because we feared that they would think that we had lost our minds or been possessed by demons ourselves. But after hearing all of the stories over the years, I am convinced that these things are real and exist somewhere out there in those mountains. This happened when I was working in Panama in 2008. I worked for the Department of State. My job at the time was to catch drug traffickers who would build their own submarine to traffic drugs up the coastline. It was my job to patrol the coast and look for these submarines. We had to travel through some dense jungle to get to our stations, and I worked the night shift most of the time because that's when all the trafficking would happen. The jungle is a very creepy place at night, and you can spook yourself out really easy if you just let your mind wander. Well, one night I got to my station with the jungle behind me and the ocean in front of me. I started to hear something walking through the trees. After about 10 minutes of hearing this thing moving around, it stopped moving. This is when things got really weird. I started to smell something very foul and rotten, like a dead animal or something like that. The smell was getting worse and worse until I could almost taste it in the air. Then all of a sudden this thing comes crashing through the trees. My station is elevated so I can get a good look at the coastline, so I have a top-down view of this thing. I couldn't tell how tall it was because of my angle, but it had this long hair all over its body and a face that looked like a cross between a human and an ape. It was extremely muscular and it walked on 2 legs. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This thing started running along the beach and then it would jump into the water for a few seconds and then come back up onto the beach. I watched this thing do this for about 10 or 15 minutes. I radioed in to my command center and told them what I saw, but they thought I was crazy because no one else had ever seen this creature. The next night when I came in, a co-worker of mine at the station had seen the exact same creature. He saw it near dusk and he was able to get a good look at its face. He said it looked like a cross between a human and an orangutan. Over the next 6 months while I was there, both my coworker and I saw this thing about a half a dozen times. This creature seemed to come out more at night and go into the water. One time I was able to shine my spotlight on it, then it looked at me and it was blinded by the light. It let out this really loud yelp like it was going to attack or something. Then it ran towards the jungle. That was the last time either of us ever saw it. Now, growing up in the US, I've heard of Sasquatch and Bigfoot, but never really believed it until I saw this thing come out of the jungle. I'm not the only one who saw it either. This took place in 2015 when I was performing training exercises in Virginia. I was staying at a cabin with a few other soldiers and we were all out on maneuvers. We had been out for about 2 days when this encounter occurred. It was around midnight and I was standing watch, which meant that I sat in one spot and observed the area around us in case of any threats. We were situated near a small town, so there wasn't much activity, but every now and then you could hear dogs barking or see lights from houses as people moved about inside. As I sat there, I noticed movement to my right, where the tree line met this field we were stationed in. At first, I thought it was one of us coming to relieve me, but as it came closer, I realized it wasn't anyone on my squad. This thing stood at least 8 feet tall and had this jet black fur all over its body. I've never seen fur so dark. It was walking on 2 legs like a human, but its head looked like that of a wolf's, with pointy ears and these glowing yellow eyes. The creature stopped walking once it reached the tree line and just stared at me for about 10 or 15 seconds before turning around and walking back into the forest. Once it turned around, I snapped out of my trance-like state and ran back to the cabin where I woke everyone else up to tell them exactly what had happened. I didn't tell them the whole story because I was afraid they would think I was crazy, but one of my squad mates had a camera with him and he went out and tried to find the creature. He never found anything, but he did capture some footage of the area where I saw the creature. I've been back to that area several times, but I've never seen anything like that again. I don't know what it was, but definitely not normal. I still get the chills thinking about it and the way it looked at me before turning around and leaving. A few people in my squad said that they have seen similar creatures in the past while out on maneuvers, but they usually stay away from people and keep to themselves. Someone in my squad said that these creatures are known as dogmen, and they believe that they are descendants of ancient tribes who lived in North America before the Europeans arrived. I don't know if this is true, but I do know that they are not normal animals. I've seen a lot of weird things in my life, but nothing compares to what I saw that night. I work for a certain 3-letter government agency, and I go on missions every few months. I can't say what we do, but these are coordinated efforts, and multiple agencies are involved. We train for these missions for several months at a time. Then, once ready, we execute the mission. It's hell on the family life, and I eventually want to get into private security at some point, but for now, it's what I do. As you can imagine, our missions can be very intense. A lot of times we deploy to hostile areas, and typically we're back home in a week. But we spend months training for that week. We think and prepare ourselves for just about all possible outcomes. The more you are prepared and the more contingencies you have in place, the more smoothly, shall I say, the mission goes. So we spent 60 days training for this specific mission in South America. And 2 days later, we deploy to our destination. I can't say where, but it's a heavily jungled area where we're at. We have a team of 13 of us, and we are to set up a base camp and then begin reconnaissance patrols. We were dropped off by a helicopter at our destination, and the chopper leaves us there. We have a few days' worth of supplies, but eventually we will be resupplied by chopper. The first day is spent setting up the camp, tents, tables, and chairs, etc. We also set up comms and some intelligence monitoring. Then we spend the next 2 days doing training on how to react in certain scenarios that may arise during our mission. We prepared for this during our training, but we still spend extra time when on site. On the 4th day, we start our patrols into the jungle surrounding our camp. I'm part of a 4-man team patrolling for about 5 hours when my team leader tells me to stop walking for a second and listen. So I do, and he points out this faint sound that sounds like a woman crying. You can barely hear it, but I stood there and I listened, and it was growing louder the more I listened to it. It sounded like a mountain lion in the wild, but there are no mountain lions here, only leopards and jaguars in the jungle. The big cats always terrify me because they're so stealthy, and if one would pounce on you, it's game over. At least there are 4 of us on patrol, and we are all watching each other's 6. We continued our patrol for another 2 hours and really didn't hear anything else out of the ordinary. That is, until we started getting towards dusk. This happened right before the sun began to set. We could still see through the denseness of the jungle. We hear all kinds of animal noises. Then all of a sudden we hear what almost sounds like a stampede of animals come through the forest. We could hear the trees and branches snapping as whatever it was came through. Then we heard this really loud growling, roaring sound that just made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Now, I've been doing my current job for 7 years, and I was in the Special Forces before that. I've been in a lot of situations, but what I saw next is enough to make you second guess everything about Mother Nature. About 50 yards out, we can all see the trees moving and the underbrush moving as something is moving through the jungle floor. Then out jumps this massive wolf creature. It leaps over this stream that is about 30 feet wide and lands on the other side on its hind legs. This thing is a beast of an animal. We all duck down and hide ourselves as this thing is looking around. I looked at my team lead and I could see the shock on his face and everyone else's. "What the fuck is that?" my team leader whispers to us. "I don't know, but it sure as shit ain't natural." Now, we haven't even started our mission yet, and we've prepared for just about every scenario possible, but I can tell you this wasn't one of them. We are all sitting there ready to fire at this giant wolf who is now dropped to all 4s and is drinking water out of the stream. It backs up, lifts its head up, starts sniffing the air, turns around, and takes off into the jungle. We all sit there for another few minutes to make sure this thing is gone before heading back to base. I go back to base and I take my helmet off, and I realize I got this entire thing recorded from my head cam. We all do, actually. I could hear my team lead calling back to headquarters to brief them on what happened. I took my cell phone and recorded what my head cam recorded out there. I played it back on one of the laptops that we had there. 15 minutes later, my team lead comes back and tells us all who are on patrol that he needs all of our recording equipment. He takes it all, and the next day everything is wiped clean. No trace of it. But I still have it on my cell phone. We ended up carrying out the mission and left 3 days later. I still have the video, but I'm terrified to release it because everything can be traced to a source, especially when you work in my line of work. I would love to send you the video, but I just can't. I can tell you that the sound that it made and the sheer power of this thing was truly terrifying. I said before that I was terrified of big cats, but this thing would devour a big cat. It wouldn't even stand a chance. Hi Donovan, I recently found your channel and wanted to share my story. I've never told this to anyone before, and I would like to remain anonymous due to me still being employed in law enforcement. I cannot provide any location details because of this. What I can tell you is that I work in the southeastern United States, and I've worked in law enforcement now going on 17 years. I've experienced my share of strange and weird encounters on the job, and they mostly have to deal with people, because people are the craziest creatures out there from my experience. Very unpredictable and very emotional when in intense situations. Anyways, this happened a few years ago when I got dispatched to an older woman's house who I knew very well. She attended my church for as long as I can remember. I get to her house and she's standing on the front porch sobbing. I go up to her and asked her what is wrong, and she said it was her dog. She had an 8-year-old cockapoo that she was always with. Her dog was outside while she was inside watching TV, and she heard it yelp. She went to go let the dog in, and she saw these strange lights in her backyard and what sounded like a very high-pitched sound right before she opened the back door. As she opens the door, she sees this spacecraft shoot off into the sky. The only thing left was her dog's collar, which was an NFL collar of her favorite football team. So I go back out to check out her story, and there is a collar laying right in the middle of her yard in the center of what appears to be dead grass. The dead grass is shaped in a perfect circle. I asked her, "Do you have a swimming pool for your grandkids? Or have you put anything in your yard recently that would kill the grass?" She said no, and that the lawn care company came by just yesterday and mowed the lawn. So at this point, I'm left scratching my head. This lady that I've now known for most of my life and never had any reason to doubt her basically tells me her dog has been abducted by aliens. In the yard is a perfect circle of dead grass 30 feet in diameter. I quickly walked it off to see. I don't know what to put in my report for this. But at this point, she finally calms down some, and I tell her that I will file a report and hopefully the dog turns up. Fast forward a week later, in the neighboring county's animal shelter, they receive a cockapoo that matches the descriptions of this woman's. Her dog had this black birthmark on its belly, so she knew it was her dog. And get this, the person who found the dog is a farmer who lives 50 miles away. He finds the dog one day after it goes missing. He waits a few days before taking the dog to the animal shelter. Now, how can this dog travel 50 miles in one day? It's virtually impossible. Like I said, I've had my fair share of weird encounters on the job, and although I didn't see it with my own 2 eyes, I saw it right after it happened. The entire thing still puzzles me to this day. Hi Donovan, I appreciate that you're getting the word out on these encounters. This took place back in April of 2006. I was on highway patrol in Kentucky on Interstate 64 in Bath County. I was traveling east on the highway about 2:30 in the morning. I had just passed over the bridge and was approaching a right turn when I saw something running across the highway in front of me. It was dark, but there was enough light from the moon to see it. This animal was running across the highway from my right to left. It ran through an area that had a wide shoulder on the right side of the highway and into a small stand of trees on the left side of the highway. I thought it was a dog or maybe a coyote at first, because it didn't seem to be that big. But as I got closer, I realized that this thing was huge. It looked like it had long hair or fur all over its body, and its color blended well with its surroundings. Its color looked like dirt or sand-colored browns and tans. I pulled over on the side of the road and watched it run into these trees. It was running on all fours right before it hit the tree line. Then it popped up on its hind legs and jumped 10 feet upwards into the trees. I thought I was losing my mind. I sat there for a few minutes trying to process what I had just seen. It was clearly some kind of animal, but it looked like a giant dog or maybe a very large wolf. I thought about going into the woods to look for tracks, but decided against it because I was by myself and I didn't want to get too far from my patrol car in case something happened. I drove back past the area about 20 minutes later, and there was nothing out of the ordinary that I could see. A few days later, while I was on patrol, I stopped at this older couple's house that was close to where this took place. I asked them if they had seen anything strange or out of the ordinary in the woods behind their house. They both looked at me like I was crazy and told me no. Nothing like that ever goes on around here. I did not tell them what it was that I saw, but just said that there was something going on in the woods that may need to be reported to a higher authority. They still acted like they didn't believe me and just brushed it off as kids messing around in the woods. I have thought about this many times since then and wondered if maybe it could have been some kind of wolf or dog-wolf hybrid. It just doesn't seem possible for there to be a wild animal of this size roaming around loose in Kentucky. Thanks again for doing what you are doing, and keep up the good work. This happened in the summer of 2008. It was my first year on the job, and I was on highway patrol in northern Wisconsin, headed west on Highway 77 towards Clam Lake. This is a 14-mile stretch of highway that is heavily forested on both sides. I was working the night shift then, and it was around 3 a.m. when on the side of the road I see this little boy around 8 to 10 years old. He was wearing a baseball cap, blue jeans, and a red shirt. I passed him and I had to do a double take because I was thinking, what is this boy doing out here all alone? I didn't see any other cars or his parents. I stopped my vehicle because I drove past him. Then I backed up to where he was. The boy was walking on the edge of the highway towards Clam Lake, and I stopped and turned my headlights off so he could see me. I got out of my car and shined my flashlight on myself so he could see that I was a police officer. I told him I'm here to help him, and where are your parents? He said they're back at the lodge. I said, well then what are you doing out here all by yourself? Now keep in mind the lodge is at least 5 miles from where we were, and it's 3 a.m. in the morning. He turns to me and says, I'm hungry. I waved him over to come get over into my car and that I'll take him back to the lodge to see his parents. I also said I think I have some chips in the car that you can eat on the way. He started walking towards me, so I turned to open the back door of my vehicle and turn around to help him in, and he's gone. Vanished. I'm wondering, where did he go? I looked all around my car. I looked under my car. And I start calling out for this boy to come back. I'm yelling that I'm here to help and I'm going to take him back to his parents. I was there for 45 minutes calling and waiting, and I never found him. I report this to the station and give them a description of the boy, and the dispatch on the other end goes quiet like the call was dropped. I asked, what is going on? He then tells me that this matches the description of a little boy who went missing in this area over 20 years ago. He continues that this happens every 5 years, that someone in the area reports that they see this little boy on the side of Highway 77 between Torrey Lake and Clam Lake. I guess I saw the ghost of that missing boy. I left the department before the next 5 years hit. It was the creepiest and saddest thing that I've ever encountered on the job. Hi Donovan, let me first start off by saying thank you for the content. I enjoy listening to the daily uploads. My grandfather, who recently passed away from old age, he was 97, told me a story not too long ago that had me convinced that certain creatures and beasts are real. My grandfather was a brigadier general in the Army, who basically serves as an advisor to the major general commanding a unit of 10 to 15,000 soldiers. He told me a story about his first deployment with the Army. This is probably about a year after he joined. They were doing a reconnaissance mission in Cambodia. There were 6 men in his unit. They basically had to hide out in the jungle for 4 days. My grandfather said that he saw several men killed by something that should not exist, and that is pure evil. He was in day 2 of this recon mission, and they were working in shifts, where 2 men would go out and they would rotate around the clock. They were monitoring the whereabouts of this highly valued target. He and his fellow soldier were on shift at the time, and it was around mid-afternoon. Their base camp was located about a mile away, and they had to hike through the jungle up this mountainside where there are caves all along the mountainside. That's where they were positioned to look down into the valley of the jungle where their target was positioned. The area was thick jungle, and the only way they could get a decent look was from this hillside. It was about a 45-minute hike to go 1 mile. They had a great vantage point where they could see their target, which was a small group of about 12 men, including their highly valued target. As they are watching, they hear this terrible sound come from the base of the valley. He said it sounded like a cross between a wolf howling and an angry gorilla who is about to attack. From his vantage point, he could see the tops of the bamboo trees moving from 100 yards out, just shaking as whatever this thing is making its way towards these group of men. Down below, there are 4 men who are standing guard with automatic weapons, patrolling the outside of their 3 makeshift buildings. He can see that these men also hear the sound, and they're all standing together watching in the direction where this thing is coming from. He said that it was coming faster and faster. The men below were scared, as he could tell by the way they were moving around their guard post. They were running back and forth trying to figure out where this thing was coming from. It was almost like they knew that this thing would be serious trouble. Then all of a sudden, everything goes dead quiet. You can hear a pin drop out there. He said if you've ever been in the jungle, it's full of noises and it's never quiet. It's basically just a constant wall of sound from all of the wildlife out there. The men look panicked as if they already knew what was coming next. They start screaming at each other and pointing all over the place. Then out of nowhere, this massive black furred creature comes from one side of the men and starts tearing them apart from limb to limb. One of the men was able to discharge his weapon at this thing, but it didn't faze it. 3 men were instantly killed. It happened so fast it was a blur. My grandfather said it was like some type of animal was shot out of a cannon at these men. They had 0 time to react. The 4th man, who discharged his weapon at this thing, turned around and started running into the jungle. And within 2 bounds, this thing leapt onto his back and broke his neck and dragged him out of sight into the jungle. Then the men from inside the buildings came out and saw the guards were all dead. They were frantically moving around and got into their vehicles and took off. My grandfather said that he and his fellow soldier watched this all unfold from a distance of a little over 100 yards away. He said that they instantly knew what they witnessed was something that should not exist. This thing, which appeared to be some type of massive wolf-like creature that stood upright, just went ballistic on these men. It took less than 30 seconds for this thing to kill 4 men and drag 1 man into the jungle. He told me that he and his fellow soldier immediately packed up their stuff and hightailed it out of there, which is when my grandfather told me that he believed in these creatures after seeing one with his own eyes. After they got back home to the U.S., he was debriefed by high-ranking officials. He was told never to speak of this again or face serious repercussions. My grandfather served in World War II and Vietnam Wars, so I know he's not a liar. I'm a security guard for a company based out of Madison, Wisconsin. I provide security details for one of their data warehouses. It's right across the street from a fairly large cemetery, which sometimes makes my night patrols a little spooky when you hear strange noises from coming over there. It doesn't normally happen, but it did this one night in the early fall of 2017. It was October 15th because earlier that night we went out to dinner for my mom's birthday at this new Mexican place that had recently opened up. I will never forget it because I got this spicy shrimp taco with a side of their hot sauce and poured it all over my taco. It didn't look that hot, but there must have been habaneros in there because I thought I was going to have to call off sick. My mouth was on such fire. So after sweating out about 5 pounds after eating this monster hot taco, I finally returned to normal and headed into work. This was about 10:30 p.m. at night because at the time I was working the 11 to 7 a.m. shift, our graveyard shift. It's a boring shift, but I listen to a ton of podcasts and read books to pass the time. I have to walk the perimeter on every hour, and it takes me about 15 minutes to walk around the entire warehouse. So it's 11:40 p.m., and I start my perimeter walk. I walk out of the main entrance and to the right and go around the warehouse and eventually come to the side that is across from the cemetery. It's a fairly large cemetery with a brick wall that goes around the perimeter of it. There are trees scattered throughout, and the grass is pretty well kept. I'm walking along when all of a sudden from behind one of the trees in the cemetery, I hear this screeching sound like some type of bird. But it's nothing I've ever heard before. It's so loud and piercing that it makes me jump. I stop and look over at the trees, but I don't see anything. Then I hear it again, this time closer to me in another tree. It's still pitch black out because there's no street lights anywhere near the cemetery. There's a few lights on the data warehouse side, but they don't shine far enough to go over to the cemetery. So I'm trying to figure out what could be making this noise. I look over at one of the tombstones and I see this large, winged, humanoid creature perched on top. I say humanoid because I shine my flashlight on it, and its face looked like a cross between a human and a bat, kind of with a pig-shaped nose pointed up, and it had these large, pointy ears on the side of its head. It also had these massive wings that were folded up, and it looked like it was wearing some type of robe or something. The wings were absolutely massive. Its body was very thin and lanky, and it had these long arms with hands and had these really long fingers. The hands reminded me of spider legs almost. I'm frozen in place as this thing is looking at me with these red eyes that glow in the light of my flashlight. Its mouth is open slightly as if it's snarling at me, but I can't hear anything coming from it. After about 10 or 20 seconds of staring at each other, I finally muster up the courage to speak to this thing. What are you? As soon as the words leave my mouth, this thing takes off into the air, flying straight up into the sky until I can no longer see it with my flashlight. I'm still trying to figure out what in the hell I just saw. I walk back towards the front of the warehouse and go to my desk, and I Skype my supervisor when I get back. He sends back an LOL face at me and tells me that it was probably a flying squirrel or something. A flying squirrel? Really? I think I know the difference between a 5-foot winged humanoid creature and a 6-inch flying squirrel. I explained to him that this thing had wings and looked like some type of demon or gargoyle. He doesn't believe me, but I know what I saw. I'm retired law enforcement, and when I was a young officer, I was working in a very mountainous area. I spent most of my shift just driving dark wooded roads. One night, I was talking to a seasoned officer about freaky stuff we have seen. I told him that a few days ago I was driving back from one of the furthest towns in our area, about 2 a.m. when I saw a woman walking on the side of the road. The area I saw her in was very dark, and no houses out there at all, so I couldn't figure out why she was walking in that area so late at night. I saw her, but I was going too fast to stop right there, so I turned around a little further away. But when I got back to where I saw her, she was gone. No trace of her, nothing. I told him I was a little freaked out about it. He told me that several years ago, he was in the same area and had stopped at the same spot to give this same woman a ride. He said she walked over to his patrol car, opened the door, and got in. He asked her where she was going, and she told him the name of the nearest town. Then she smiled at him, thanked him for picking her up, and then vanished right before his eyes. He laughed at me, and he also told me, "Don't be surprised if you run into her again. She isn't the only one either. I have seen some freaky things out there. Just downright freaky. Love your channel. I had a friend in school whose last name was Donovan. Stay cool." They are everywhere. My mother told us of many super creepy experiences she had while growing up in a rural area. One of them that comes to my mind is when she was about 10 or 12 years old. Her mom went out and left her with her older siblings. She prepared lunch before leaving and left it wrapped up in a basket. To discourage them from getting to the food prematurely, she hung the basket on a door with very strict instructions. Then close to lunchtime, she heard an unusually loud creaking sounds coming from the open door. To her shock and horror, she saw a little girl, the exact replica of herself, dress, hoop earrings and all, hanging on the top of the door close to the basket. Of course, she screamed and got the attention of her siblings. By then, the figure had disappeared. Well, they just passed it off as their sister who was always seeing things. My mom was a gifted person who could see into the realm of the spirit, good or bad. Interesting, as a friend of mine swore she and a friend of hers both saw something like that here in Alberta, Canada, walking down some train tracks behind her home about 15 years ago. I thought she was bullshitting me as a joke at first because she knows I don't believe in the cryptozoology stuff. She was serious as soon as I realized and swore she saw this wolf-like thing walking on its hind legs. I believe she believes she saw it. Whether she did or not, she sure believes she did. A man I know is a former police officer. He had retired and was working as a security guard when he told me this account. Years ago, he was on patrol late at night on tribal lands. He was driving slowly on a dirt road and saw a huge dog walking in the middle of the road. Its rear was towards him. He continued to approach it. At about 10 feet, it stopped and faced him. He swears that it had the face of a man. Then it sauntered off the road and disappeared into the forest. I'm an officer in Arkansas. What I saw changed me. We rotate from days to nights every 3 months, and 2 weeks back on nights. I was driving through a neighborhood, and what I saw I will never forget. As I turned off the highway onto the street, I observed a huge something, maybe 8 foot, levitating in the air, speeding down the street. I stopped my patrol car, turned on my spotlight, and waited. I then drove down to the intersection where I saw this thing, and it has disappeared. I didn't patrol that neighborhood that night after seeing it. I saw one of these creatures known as Dogman in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. If I was alone, I honestly would have thought I was hallucinating. Thank God someone was with me, and I asked them, "Do you see what I'm looking at?" and asked them to describe it because I didn't want to put anything in their head. They described exactly what I was looking at, and honestly, I couldn't make this up even if I wanted to. It was so crazy that I have no other way to describe it. I used to drive a semi, and one trip in the state of Washington on I-5 going north, I had a large black hairy animal stop on the side of the highway. It stood up and I noticed its hind legs kind of looked like a dog's, but it was higher. And when it looked my way, its eyes were red. Its face and head was shaped long and narrow, and it had very long hair. It ran across the highway almost like a horse in a lope. Scary. I have a photo of a shapeshifter. I bought an old 1930s photo album from northern Quebec. It had a photo of 2 Native Americans outside an old general store in a horse-drawn carriage. They were photographed as one half human and half sheep. The other form was a sheep, but you could make out a human face underneath the face of the sheep. The big secret is the fact that the Black Ops military complex used to breed and train dogmen and werewolves in Virginia and Colorado. The dogman creatures were getting out of hand as they were breeding in the wild, so they started calling them back to the 2 compounds via GPS and communication devices implanted in the creature's ear canal. When they got back to their compound, these creatures were being euthanized. Supposedly, according to a recently retired SWAT soldier, every county in every state has 4 to 20 dogmen, and sometimes the same amount of werewolves. The werewolves are more sophisticated creatures, bigger and smarter than a dogman. Also, they can speak fluent English. Werewolves are used by CIA handlers in South and Central America drug wars. 2 werewolves can take out a whole squadron of drug defense soldiers. Just a note, the Black Ops secret military complex controls almost everything in the world, including the secret space program and UFOs. They do have separate departments, but are all Black Ops, and their actions are paid for by your tax dollars through the Pentagon Secret Black Ops Fund. Most of the elected Washington congressmen know little or nothing about these operations.
When I was 17, I used to hang out with my buddy literally all the time during the summertime. We really had nothing else better to do. I can distinctly remember one evening we were bored. I think I had about $8 or $9. I told my friend, "Hey, let's go walk to the store and get some Mountain Dews. Come back and play video games." We did those things already, but for whatever reason, I was really craving a Mountain Dew then. I don't know why. He agreed, and we both walked down to the store. Now, the store was quite a bit far away, and you had to walk through this really sketchy long stretch of road that had thick woods on both sides. Being in California, at least middle to upper California, these were like forests. Like the kind of forest you see in the Pacific Northwest. Not the shrubbery and loose woods that you would see down in Southern California. I thought I should make that distinction. We had walked this stretch of road many times. I think it was a little over a mile, maybe a mile and a half, but we would go there often to get snacks, soda, and whatever else stuff that a 17-year-old eats. Well, this time was really no different. It being a summer evening, the sun was still out and it was still beautiful weather, active people walking their dogs and cars going back and forth. It wasn't a dead road by any means, but there were fewer houses. I'm wanting to say all this stuff because I want to mention that this was a very lively area. Maybe not as lively as any downtown area, but there were people present, cars going by. We were maybe halfway there to the store when we heard strange noises off to the forest across the street. It made us both stop, look at each other, and question, what was that we had just heard? It sounded like a dog getting ripped apart or something. Maybe like a cougar attacking a dog. I think after discussing it for a moment, that was the conclusion we came to. But it didn't quite sound like that. Living in California, I've had my fair share of hearing cougars, although I've only heard a few dogs. But this is exactly what it would sound like. We kept on walking and going back on our conversation of whatever it was we were talking about. Maybe 10 minutes later, we're now nearing the end of the walk and we hear it again. Except for this time, the noises are more distorted and closer. As if whatever it was following us paralleled us in the woods. This time, though, the sounds were different. It didn't sound like another animal attacking a dog or something. When I mentioned it the first time, I mentioned the accompanying noises of a cougar making noise, like a hissing sound, along with the whimpering and whining of a dog, even though they didn't sound quite right, not like you'd actually hear. I know it's hard to explain, but when we got near the end of the walk and we heard these noises again and they were different, it's almost like the sound of a dog and the hissing of a cat or something, like that was overlaid on top of each other. It sounded very large and very distorted, like playing through a lo-fi radio or something. Whatever it was seemed to sound really big. Imagine a bison making that noise, something of enormous size. It's really hard to describe accurately. My friend and I just kept looking at each other like, what on earth is making these noises? There were some passers-by on the other side of the street. A biker and a lady walking her German Shepherd, all three of which, including the dog, made glances at the noises and just seemed to carry on. The lady, if I remember right, had her headphones in. I remember that she looked over, too, signifying that my friend and I were not indeed crazy and we were hearing something strange and out of the ordinary. Here's where the story gets even crazier. We go to the store and we both load up on a Mountain Dew. Since being 17, you seem to think you're really cool if you drink Mountain Dew. I'm really not sure what my obsession was at that age. We're leaving and we're about halfway back down this long stretch of road. Keep in mind it's probably somewhere between 7 and 8 o'clock in the midst of the summer. 7 or 8 o'clock, I think, and it's still sunny out. Cars are going by. There's still people walking. It's still lively. It's California, after all. The noises began to get even more violent sounding, if that makes any sense. It sounded like a flock of animals being ripped apart, minus the skin-ripping noises and blood and tissues being torn. I don't know how else to accurately tell you. That's what it sounded like. Like you would hear a roar, and overlaid with that roar was what sounded like distorted dog screams. I don't know. My friend, when we ended up getting back, said that he might think it might be a skinwalker. But I don't know. It didn't sound far off in the woods. I had never even heard of a skinwalker before. He ended up telling me what a skinwalker was. He's not native, but he does have native friends and has heard of what they are before. Except we were in California, nowhere near any reservation that I am or was aware of at the time. Well, come to find out later that night, people in the area had reported seeing a large, strange, upright canine figure in the area. I know this because he called a friend of his, or maybe it was a family member, one or the other, I can't quite remember. They were talking about the weird noises that we had just heard a few hours prior. He'd gotten in the conversation over the phone. Since his friend or family member, whichever it was on speakerphone, he didn't know he was on speakerphone, was talking about it and saying that, yeah, the whole neighborhood's kind of freaked out right now. They're not sure what it was. I almost mentioned to him, asking if he meant werewolf. My friend mentioned the word werewolves, and he said, nah, that's not what it was. Something else entirely, some strange animal. We don't know what it was. Then the rest of the conversation just went normal. Since then, I've always had this thing that I do believe that werewolves or animals like that exist somewhere. Maybe a skinwalker, maybe a werewolf. I don't know. Out here in California, though, I wouldn't put it past me that something weird is out there looking in the darkness of the woods.
Thanks for listening to these stories. If you would like me to read more stories from the comments section, let me know. And please post your strange and weird encounters. Don't forget to check out Lilith Dread's channel. The link is below. And of course, if you're into true crime and you like my narrations, check out my channel, Donovan Dread True Crime. I just released a news story about the unsolved case of Elizabeth Barraza. Take care and God bless. Hey Donovan, I had this very strange and supernatural encounter when I went hiking with a group of friends. This happened in the summer of 2011, shortly after my junior year in college. I went hiking with a group of friends at Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming. The group consisted of 6 people. There were 3 guys and 3 girls. We were all pretty athletic and had gone on many hikes together. The hike we took was up the Garnett Canyon Trail to a place which is right at the top of the canyon. It's about 8.5 miles round trip with a fairly steep incline for most of it. We left the trailhead around 7 a.m. and got to our destination around 11 a.m. It was a clear day with no wind and it was pretty warm already at that point. We decided to take a break there because it was such a nice spot overlooking the valley below us and the river that ran through it. We ate lunch, drank some water, and just enjoyed being outside in nature. Then we started heading back down because it was starting to get later in the afternoon and we wanted to be out of the park by 5 p.m. So we started heading down off the height of the trail and began our descent into the valley below us. About halfway down, we heard these sounds coming from off the trail, like an animal was moving through the forest. We couldn't see anything and didn't really give it much thought, so we just continued on our way down. As we kept going, we noticed whatever it was off the trail was tracking us. We kept hearing it for the next 10 minutes. We would stop and then the movement would stop. At this point, we knew something was up, and the girls with us started getting creeped out. One of my friends yelled into the woods, "Get out of here," thinking it was an animal that would be scared away by a loud human voice. We began hiking down the trail again, and sure enough, we were being followed again. We kept talking, and we were trying to be loud so that if it was a bear, it would hopefully go away, but we still couldn't see anything off the trail. It was pretty thick at this point of the trail. Then about a half mile down trail, it started opening up a little bit, and this thing was still following us. We kept looking for it. Every few seconds, somebody was turning their head and scanning the trees off the trail. That's when my friend saw it. He said, "Stop and look right over there." I looked in the direction he was pointing, and there it was. This huge Sasquatch standing behind a trunk of a tree, peeking its head out at us. I say Sasquatch because you can't mistake this thing for anything else. It was like 3 feet taller than me, and its shoulders were sticking out on both sides of the trunk it was hiding behind. Its head was huge, and it had this big barrel chest. I mean, this thing looked like it could have been a linebacker for the NFL if it chose to do so. We all stood there in total shock, not saying anything. Then my friend yelled at it, "Why are you following us? We are leaving now, so get out of here." It just stood there looking at us. Finally, we started moving again, heading down the trail at a much faster pace now. We're about 40 minutes away from the parking lot at this point, and we couldn't get there fast enough. The Sasquatch seemed more curious than angry or anything like that. Maybe it was toying with its prey, I don't know. But if it wanted to, it could have torn us all apart with ease, and there would be nothing we could do to stop it. It eventually stopped following us as the trail got narrow at a certain point. It always stayed in the woods and never came out on the trail. This was a crazy experience. I've told this story many times and no one ever believes me. But then I'll call one of my friends and they all say the same thing, and then people start coming around a bit. Like I said, there were 6 of us that went hiking that day, and every single one of us saw this thing. I just wanted to say thanks for your content and getting the word out there because we all know that these things are real. Hey there, Donovan. I really liked your channel and thanks for all that you do. This happened back in 2008, the first day of buck season in Ohio. Now let me start off by telling you that I was never a hunter and I never grew up around it. But I decided to get into it that year because I had a good friend of mine who had a cabin and would go hunting every year with his family. Whenever I get into something, I always get really into it. So I researched what I should buy as far as a hunting rifle and decided to purchase a Browning 30-06. I took and I passed the hunter safety course and I got my license. Then I went out to the range and I practiced shooting quite a bit. I got pretty good at shooting and was confident enough to go out hunting. So the day before, I drive up to my buddy's camp and we had a few beers the night before, which I don't recommend if you plan on getting up at 5 a.m. to get to your spot. We head out there and walk about a half a mile into the woods, and my friend and I were sitting with each other on this log. We had a good view of the woods because we were a little elevated on this log. I couldn't see a thing at this point because it's basically pitch black out. But my buddy knows where he's going and so does everyone else because they've been hunting up here every year. So we're sitting there and daylight comes and right above us is a bunch of turkeys sitting on a branch in a tree. It doesn't really mean anything, I just thought it was interesting that we sat under a bunch of turkeys. We sat there for a while and didn't see anything, so we decided to move around some, and we sat in different places after my buddy Ray showed me where to go. Now I'm still a total rookie, but I was looking forward to getting my first buck and field dressing it and getting it butchered and all that stuff. Probably no big deal to someone who hunts all the time, but I was really looking forward to it. So I'm sitting there for about 30 minutes and I could see a good ways, but there's a lot of trees, so I could only take a shot that's about 50 to maybe 100 yards at most. That's when I heard something moving through the woods, and I could see something behind the trees. I was thinking this is going to be my first buck. I pointed my rifle in that direction and tried to see it through the scope. It took me a minute to find it, but then I was right on it. However, it wasn't a buck. It looked like a giant dog. I was confused because there are no wolves in Ohio, and this thing was way too big to be a coyote. It was moving through the woods on all fours, and I could see its back legs, and they looked like a dog's. But it had this long tail which was really thick. It would swing its tail back and forth as it moved through the woods. I'm trying to figure out what this thing is because I've never seen anything like it before. I got to a point where I could see it perfectly through my scope. It kept moving through the woods, and then all of a sudden, in less than 5 seconds, it changed from going on all fours to standing up on 2 legs. It stood straight up with no effort at all. It swung its tail round behind itself and then started walking upright. At that point, I knew that this wasn't right, and I yelled out to my buddy Ray while still keeping this thing in view of my scope. As soon as I yelled, this thing dropped down to all fours and took off. I lost it right away. A second later, my buddy Ray comes over and asks, "Did you see something?" I was like, "Yeah, but it wasn't a buck. You're not going to believe this. I just saw this massive wolf." He started laughing and said, "What are you talking about? There are no wolves here, dummy." I was like, "Man, I am not even kidding right now. I saw this giant wolf, and it was on all fours, and then it stood up on its hind legs and started walking around. Then when I called out to you, it got on all fours and it took off. I watched the entire thing through my scope, up close and personal." He said, "Maybe it's someone's dog that got loose." Well, there was no sense in trying to convince him about what I saw. He wasn't going to believe me. I didn't see it again, and I never did get a buck that year. I took a shot at one, but missed it, and my buddy Ray ended up shooting it. The next year, I sold my Browning 30-06 to my friend Mike and never went hunting again. Donovan, this is going to sound crazy. Well, because it is. I live just outside of New Orleans in swamp country. This happened 2 weeks ago on June 21st, right after my bowling league on Tuesday night. My house basically sits right next to the Mississippi River, and I have a dock right on the water. My house is on a canal. The canal feeds into the Mississippi River. My dock's about 20 feet wide and 100 feet long. It's a pretty large dock. It's elevated about 6 feet off the water with a staircase that goes down into the water. I have a boat dock there as well. The house is surrounded by swamp, literally all around it except for where my driveway goes in and out of the property. So after bowling, 2 friends and I were hanging out on my dock, drinking a few Bud Heavies, when we hear something thrashing around in the water. It's kind of far off, maybe about 50 yards out, so we can't make anything out. I have a light on the dock, but it doesn't shine that far into the canal. We do have gators, and they're most active at night, so we brush it off as a gator and continue hanging out on the dock. About 5 minutes later, we hear the same loud thrashing. Only this time it's to the right of my dock, near that edge of the canal. We can't see anything, but we know something's there. Figuring this is the same gator that was splashing around a few minutes ago, we shine the flashlight that I had over in the direction, and what we saw is something I'll never forget. I grabbed my flashlight, and I went to the edge of my dock and shined it into the direction of the noise. Then on the bank of the canal, I see this humanoid creature climb out of the water's edge onto land. This thing looked like a cross between a gator and a man. I've thought about it since and researched it online, and it kind of looks like that lizard from the Spider-Man movie, only its head was shaped different. This thing stood as tall as a human and had green scaly skin and these muscular legs. It had 4 fingers with claws on the end of them and this massive gator-like tail. I'm just in shock, and I can't believe what I'm seeing. My 2 friends come over to the edge of the dock, and they see it too. We all stand there for a few seconds, not knowing what to do next. The creature looks at us and makes this hissing sound, almost like a snake, but with much more bass to it. It slowly walks out of the water, then begins to pick up pace, and then it takes off along the side of the canal into the darkness. It ran like a man, not like a gator. However, it looked so odd with its tail. It had long arms that just swung as it ran, and this massive tail that was moving back and forth as it was taking off. We were frozen in place for a moment after it left. We just looked at each other in disbelief on what we just saw. We had to be imagining this because lizard men just don't exist. We sat there for a good 10 minutes talking about what we saw. My friend always carries, so at least we had some protection if this thing returns. I was debating on calling the cops or animal control, but what am I going to tell them? That my friends and I, who were drinking a couple Bud Heavies, saw a lizard man crawl out of the Mississippi River and just take off. Yeah, right. No one would believe me. That's why I'm writing this to you, Donovan, so you can share it on your channel and hopefully make people aware that these types of creatures exist. Be safe and take care. Hi, Donovan. First, thanks for getting people's stories out there. After my experience, I've been wanting to share my story, but just haven't until now. I do watch some other channels like yours, like What Lurks Beneath. I just never really took the time to put this down and send it in. So my encounter took place when I was at college. I was at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. It's in Indiana, PA. I lived off campus my sophomore year in what used to be called the Carriage House Apartments. I know that they've probably changed since. Actually, a lot of things have probably changed because this was about 26 years ago when it happened. So the night started out at my apartment and we had some friends over. There were about a dozen of us, both boys and girls. Of course, we were drinking, and back then the beer of choice was a 36-pack of Genesee Light that I would get delivered to my apartment with my fake ID. Trust me, it wasn't because of the taste, but it was the most that we could get for our money back then. Man, I miss the 90s. Anyways, I can't remember what we were doing, but we would always end up playing guitar because I played and so did two of my friends. We then thought it would be fun and spooky to go through Oakland Cemetery that was less than a mile away. So there's 12 of us all walking down the street and we come to the cemetery. We're walking around looking at all the old graves and headstones when we come upon a small hill that overlooked one of the smaller sections of the cemetery. It was spooky because it was dark and there was no moon out that night, and we could hear dogs barking in the distance. We all started talking about how this place is probably haunted by all the people buried there. One friend of mine said he read somewhere that cemeteries are portals to other dimensions or something like that. So we laughed it off and we just kept walking around. Then I saw someone standing on top of one of the tombstones way over in the corner where I just mentioned before. He looked like a shadow at first, but as we got closer, I noticed he had on black clothes, long hair, and a beard. He looked like he was leaning his arm with his elbow resting on top of this headstone. As we got closer, he never moved or acknowledged us in any way. So my friends and I thought this guy must be drunk or high, just hanging out in the graveyard at night. So I keep walking towards this man, and now I can make out features like his eyes, which were open, staring straight ahead and not blinking at all. Also, you could see his face, which seemed very pale white, almost ghostly looking, if you know what I mean. At this point, my friends are getting freaked out because he still hasn't moved or acknowledged us. So I say, screw it, let's just walk right up to him and see what happens when we get close enough to him. As soon as I said that and started walking towards him, he let out this scream that was so loud right at us, and then he disappeared. We freaked out and ran down this hill that led out of the cemetery. I was running so fast that I tripped over one of the girls in front of me. She ended up breaking her finger due to us both falling on the concrete. I felt so bad, but we were just so scared and we were all running down this hill. I couldn't slow myself down in time. Plus, it was just so dark out. Anyways, we went back to my place except for the two girls who ended up going to the hospital to get her finger fixed. We were all in shock by what we just witnessed because all of us heard it and saw that man or whatever that was by the gravestone. Hi Donovan, I watch your show all the time and I wanted to share a story. Actually, it's a story from my brother-in-law who is in law enforcement in West Virginia. He just shared this story with me this past weekend when we had a 10th birthday party for my daughter. He said I could share this story as long as I leave his name and exact place of work out of the story. He was working the 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. shift and was responding to a call they received from an older couple who reported a possible break-in. He said they got the call around 7:30 p.m. and they got there about 15 minutes after. The couple lived out a little ways in a rural area, which was odd to begin with because they don't normally get these types of calls out there. When he arrives, it's dark out because it's early November, and he knocks on the door and the wife answers and tells him what transpired. She explains that the couple were watching Jesse Waters on Fox News and that they heard something really loud banging on their back door. This is an older couple with no pets and no neighbors nearby. The closest neighbor is a half a mile down the road. It's a very large property with woods on 2 sides, and the rest is an open field. They have a large deck on the back of their house that overlooks an open field. So he asks her what they heard, and she tells him that they went to see what was causing the noises and they went to their back door. They couldn't see anything at first, but then they turned on the floodlight to the backyard, and there it was. This dark figure in the backyard with wings like a bird and these huge red eyes that look like reflectors from a bicycle. This man or creature, whatever it was they saw, was standing on 2 feet, then opened its wings that spanned about 10 foot across and flew to the back of their property. The wife said she had never seen anything like it before in her life, and she's lived there for over 50 years. My brother-in-law said he nodded while the lady was telling him this, and said, "Ma'am, do you mind if I go in your backyard and check this out?" She said, "No, not at all. Please do, officer." So my brother-in-law goes around the house from the side and goes into the backyard. The backyard itself is probably about 150 yards of grass before it hits the woods. He said he was walking around looking for anything, and then he heard this loud flapping noise behind him. When he turned around, it was gone. He thought, what the hell? At first, he was kind of shaking his head and laughing on the inside from what this couple originally told him. But now he was starting to wonder if there was something more to their story. He continued to look around the yard for another 15 minutes, and there was nothing. He said it was the weirdest thing that ever happened to him on the job, and he's been doing this for over 11 years now. He went back to the couple and told them that everything appeared to be okay, and that he couldn't see anything. He went back to the couple and told them that everything appeared to be okay and that he couldn't see anything. He advised them to call back if they encountered anything else, and that he would make sure that he sends a unit by to check on them over the next few shifts. Even though he heard those wings flapping, he couldn't see anything and there really wasn't anything he could do. So he reports the incident as a possible break-in, and the officer on the next shift goes by the couple's house. He drives by around 2 a.m. Of course, all the lights were off. So the officer shines a spotlight in the couple's backyard from the street, and sure enough, that officer saw the same thing that this couple saw earlier. This large dark figure that looked like a man with its wings was in their backyard. It looked like it was digging for something in their backyard. When he shined his light onto the creature, it was hunched over, digging something up. And then it turned towards the light and had these really large red eyes. They were reflecting back into the light. It took 2 steps and then flew off, making this really odd sound like some sort of muffled screaming noise. The officer ended up staying there for another 45 minutes, and no sign of this thing were there. Apparently it was gone, or maybe it was just watching from a distance until the officer left. Again, there's not much he can do as there's no active threat. He can just patrol the area again to see if this thing comes back. Over the next 2 weeks, they would send an officer to patrol by their house, and nothing was ever seen again. The thing must have wanted something in their backyard. Both my brother and I were wondering what could be in this older couple's backyard that this thing wanted. I'm not sure, but maybe one of your listeners would know. I work in law enforcement in the state of Idaho. I've been a police officer for over 10 years now. I'm also a hunter and an outdoorsman. I know what wildlife sounds like, what they do, and how they act. I was on highway patrol one night in the summer of 2005, near Boise National Forest. It was a warm summer night, so I had my driver's side window down. I had pulled over to eat my lunch, a turkey sandwich with hot pepper spread, mustard, and a slice of provolone. I eat the same thing every day. Boring, I know, but it works for me. So I'm pulled over on this long, narrow pull-off area with trees on both sides and a small ditch running down the edge of it. I'm sitting in my patrol car facing east towards the mountains with my driver's side window down. It was around 10 p.m., so it was dark out, but there was still enough light from the moon to see pretty well. All of a sudden, something ran across the road about 30-40 yards in front of me. Sounded like two large rocks being hit together as it ran across the pavement. I didn't see it as I was messing around with my radio at the time, but I sure did hear it. Sounded like an elk running across the highway. So I didn't think anything of it at the time and continued eating my lunch. I was about halfway through my sandwich when I heard a noise coming from the ditch to my right. It sounded like a scream in the ditch. So I put down my sandwich, picked up my flashlight, and walked around to the front of my patrol car to investigate. As I got around to the front of my car, whatever it was in the ditch stood up on two legs and started walking away from me with its back facing the mountains. The wind blew towards me and it smelled like death, like a rotting corpse. I shined my flashlight on it and got a good look. This thing towered over me. It looked like a skeleton with a deer or elk's head. It had skin, but its ribs were showing through its skin like it was attacked or was in the process of decaying. It was so tall and the face looked like a decaying elk head with these razor-sharp teeth showing through its mouth. The eyes were sunken in and the ears were very small. It had this long, skinny neck and huge shoulders. I've never seen anything like this before. It was so freaky looking that I couldn't speak for a moment. Finally, I got my wits about me and asked, "What are you?" It didn't answer, and I really wasn't expecting an answer, but the words just came out of my mouth. It just kept walking backwards towards the mountains, then slowly turned around and kept walking, and not in any hurry, like it didn't even care if I was there or not. I didn't want to shoot at this thing because it looked like it was already dead, and I would just piss it off. So I just stood there and I watched it walk away from me into the trees. Its legs were really long and it walked very smoothly for something that looked like a decaying corpse. The smell was getting fainter and fainter as it walked away from me. I stood there for about 5 minutes watching this thing walk through the trees until I couldn't see it or hear it any longer. This whole encounter probably lasted about 5 minutes from start to finish. I was so freaked out by what I saw that I immediately got in my patrol car and drove back to the station, a 30-minute drive away. I didn't even finish my sandwich. When I got back to the station, I told some of the officers about what had happened. They all thought I was crazy, however, one of my friends did believe me. I didn't tell anyone for a while after that, but when I did, they said that there have been several sightings in the Boise National Forest over the years. This is why I never told anyone about it right away, because people would think I'm nuts. But now that I know that others have had encounters with this thing, it gives me comfort to know that other people have experienced the same thing I did. I worked in federal law enforcement, and my job was to provide security for a classified location in the Northern Virginia area. The facility is currently shut down due to what I'm going to tell you. It was located in a place where you would never guess there's classified things happening there. There was a lot of other businesses in this area, so it was very unsuspecting. However, the facility did have fencing all around it. It was an 8-foot tall cast iron fence that was designed so someone couldn't just jump over it. We provided 24-hour on-site security and surveillance for this facility, and we worked in several shifts, 7 to 3, 3 to 11, and 11 to 7. We would rotate every month, and the 7 to 3 shift was pretty boring. Actually, all of the shifts were boring because nothing really ever happened, and we were only allowed on the main floor of the building. Everything else was off limits and locked down with biometric security. We all had our own theories of what was happening in this facility because we were never told what it was. We all believed that it was some sort of off-the-books intel agency or maybe even some type of testing lab. It's mostly underground. There was a 3,000 square foot building that was mostly empty, and we had access to that, but then there were these elevators that went down to several subfloors. But I never knew how many. We didn't have access to any of the subfloors. So this one night I was working with a buddy of mine on the midnight shift, the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift, and I hear this explosion inside the building on one of the subfloors. I'm pretty sure it was something gone wrong because I could feel it through the floor. I radioed for my coworker who was walking outside at the time to come inside because I think something bad just happened. That's when these alarms started going off. But they were kind of muted. They were only going off on the subfloors and not in the main building. I heard something going on through the floor, like something was destroying the facility. All I could think of was some type of Hulk-like creature going nuts on one of the subfloors causing a ruckus. Literally, 5 minutes later, this task force shows up in a semi along with 3 black Humvees. One of the men came over and started asking me questions and if there was a breach. I said no, but it sounds like something terrible had just happened downstairs. He told me that they were there to address and contain the issue and told me and my partner just to stay put. So he goes over to the semi and they use this hydraulic lift to lower this container and bring it into the building. This thing was about 10 feet long and 5 feet in diameter, and it looked like it was made out of 6-inch thick steel with these massive bolts holding it together. There's 15 men who bring this container into the building and take it down to one of the subfloors. I'm just standing there watching this unfold, wondering what the hell is going on. My buddy and I were then locked down in the security office because they didn't want anyone else to see what was going on. So for the next 30 minutes, we can feel something going on below us as we're in the security office. Then shortly after, they come back up with this same container and also several body bags and load everything into the semi. I look at my coworker and we are just like, what just happened down there? After loading everything into the semi, this one team member tells us that we are all clear and not to mention this to anyone. I don't know what happened down there. It sounded like some type of experiment gone wrong. It had to be some type of creature or beast because why else would they need a container so strong? Over the next few days, there were several cleanup crews that came in and out of the facility. Then 2 weeks later, we were all reassigned to different jobs. Hi Donovan. Let me first say that I feel a little weird telling this story, just because it's so unbelievable if you didn't experience it yourself. I've never told anyone this for this simple fact. Here it goes. I was on highway patrol one night last summer in North Carolina. It was about 2 a.m. and I was behind this old Chevy truck. I was on Girton Highway that runs through the mountains. I'm cruising along when all of a sudden I see this huge black figure leap from the side of the road and onto the roof of that old Chevy truck. It happened so fast that I had to do a double take to make sure that what I saw was real. It landed on its feet and then in one fluid motion turned around and looked right at me. At first, all I could see was its silhouette against the moonlit sky behind it. But as I continued to look, I could see that it had very broad shoulders and long arms which were now resting on top of this guy's cab. Its head seemed small compared to its body size. and it had these huge wings. It stared at me for about 10 seconds or so before jumping back down off the truck and taking off running across the highway into some thick brush alongside a park. As soon as it took off running away from me towards the park, his entire body became engulfed in a shadow, like someone flipped a switch turning him into darkness. Within seconds, he disappeared into nothingness. After watching him disappear right before my eyes like that, my heart started beating hard enough to feel it pounding in my temples. I turned around and pulled up to the park to see if I could see what this thing was, but there was nothing there. But I could hear this faint sound that sounded like a baby crying. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, so I kept looking around. I went inside the park and searched for another few minutes, and that's when I saw that same huge black figure running full speed at me from across the park. I drew my weapon, and as soon as I was ready to fire, it leapt up in the air and flew away heading westbound. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I'm pretty sure it was some kind of demon. If not, it was certainly evil. Hi Donovan. I found your channel a few weeks ago, and I've been enjoying your content. I was always hesitant to share my story because this happened a few years ago. I've actually only told very few people, and you'll soon find out why. It's just too wild of a story. When I tell it, people usually shake their heads at me like I'm crazy. I saw that you have quite a few people from law enforcement tell their story, so I wanted to share mine. Please keep my identity hidden. Unfortunately, I can't disclose where this took place, but it happened in the summer of 2019. I was on patrol going through town, and it was just another typical Saturday night. People were out late at the bars, and nothing was out of the ordinary. After I drove through town, I was almost back at the station when I received a call from dispatch. Apparently, someone that lives close to the cemetery on the east side of town said there was something going on there. Maybe some kids partying. They weren't real clear, but there was a commotion going on over there. I was on the west end of town at this point, so I had to turn around, and it took me about 15 minutes to get there. When I arrived, I didn't see anything at first, but I heard something going on over this hill. I couldn't drive to where the noise was coming from, so I had to park my car. Then I grabbed my flashlight, and I headed out to see what was going on. I start walking up this hill, and once I get to the top, I see a group of about 6 or 7 people. They were all dressed in these black robes, and they had a body lying on the ground. I thought it was some kind of cult, so I shined my light at them and shouted, "Police, just stay where you are and don't move." When they turned around, I almost dropped my flashlight. These things were not people. They looked like something out of a horror movie. They had shriveled up gray skin and these glowing eyes and pointed teeth, and they were very tall and thin. I'm 5'10", and they were at least a foot or two taller than me. Now, when I saw them in those black robes at first, I knew I was going to run into some crazies. However, I was not expecting this. I pulled my weapon and aimed it at them and told them to stay where they were. But they just all turned around and started walking into the woods. I yelled again for them to stop, and they just kept walking into the woods until they disappeared. The body on the ground was a woman who looked to be in her early 20s. She was lying there in a white robe and nothing else on. She seemed like she was in a trance. I don't know what they did to her, but she was lying there like a statue. I tried to wake her up by putting my hand on her shoulder, and I just shook her a little bit to see if she would come to. After about 20 seconds, she started coming around, and she was shocked and crying. She had no idea where she was or what she was doing there. I told her, "You're safe now, and I'm a police officer." I explained that I found her here with these people all around dressed in black that took off into the woods. After she calmed down, I asked her if she had any idea how she ended up there. She told me that she went out in the town to meet up with some friends and was waiting for them to arrive. That's the last thing she remembers. I walked her down to my patrol car and took her home and filed a report at the station. I couldn't let this go, though. I wanted to find out what those things were. They were not human, I know that. I went back to the cemetery the next day, very first thing. I searched there for about 30 minutes looking for any trace of evidence. Then I found this strange gel substance over several trees. It looked like a clear, slimy gel. It was caked on several trees. I put on some evidence gloves and took some samples. I knew of one company that we worked with in the past that did chemical testing. I was going to see if I could send this in. I put some in an evidence bag and drove back to the station. I sent it in to get the chemical analysis and I received a call a few days later. They said that when they received my sample, there was nothing in it, just an empty bag. As soon as I heard that, I thought to myself, what is going on? How can this just dissolve like that? I went back to the same spot where I collected the sample just a few days earlier. It had rained the day after that incident occurred. There was no more evidence of the slimy gel anywhere. I don't know what I was dealing with that night, and it still has me confused to this day. Hi, Donovan. I wanted to tell you a story about a time that I went camping with my parents in New Jersey. This was about 1995. I was an only child, so I always had to find ways to entertain myself while my parents set up camp or cooked or did whatever adults did. We had everything set up perfectly outside our RV on a private campground. My parents didn't like roughing it too much, but loved to be outdoors. On the second night of our trip, I wanted to sleep outside, but my parents said no. It would be too dangerous. I was really mad about it, but I was a kid. I took their advice and lay down in the RV trying to fall asleep. They ended up falling asleep before me, and I decided I would sneak out and sleep under the stars on my own. I slowly crept outside under the stars. It was a beautiful late summer night. I laid back in some grass and stared up at the stars. I knew I could fall asleep now. That's when I heard it. It was a sound that I had never heard before. It sounded like something from Jurassic Park, but it was really happening somewhere around me. It made my skin crawl and my hair stand up on the back of my neck. I couldn't tell where it came from. It echoed through the trees around us, making the source impossible to find. I looked over at our RV to see if my parents had woken up. There was no movement. I was about 30 feet from the safety of the RV, and I knew I had to try to sneak back in quietly. Then the sound happened again. I was terrified that there was some sort of dinosaur or dragon that was going to kill me. Walking back to the RV, I looked up, and there on top of it had lightly landed a giant bat-like creature, but with this disgusting pig-like human face with fangs. It had these pointed ears and red eyes. It stared down at me and snarled. Its hairy body stretched out to show off its massive size and wingspan as it balanced on its hind legs. I screamed and ran into the woods. This is what woke my parents. I don't know how far in I was when I began to hear my parents call for me. They finally caught up to me and demanded to know why I would sneak out. I kept promising that I would never do it again, and I tried to tell them that we had to get inside because of this monster. They looked at each other concerned, thinking I was making it up. My father grabbed my arm and we started walking back to our RV, but we were stopped in our tracks by this loud banging, followed by some screeching. We hesitated, but my father marched on to see what the commotion was all about. The monster was on the roof of our RV again, only this time it was crouched like it was ready to take off. It looked down at us and snarled again. We saw that it had completely wrecked the outside of our camp, and its angry eyes only told us that it was looking for something it didn't find. The next thing we knew, it was taking off. Its giant wingspan was creating wind pushing down towards us. Then it was gone. My father pulled me close to him and ran us all indoors. We sat in the RV unable to speak for some time. My parents knew I wasn't lying, but they had no idea how to explain what they just saw. My father very quietly went back outside and picked up all of the mess very slowly while my mother held me. I ended up falling asleep that way. The next morning, my parents were both already up and packed. It looked like they hadn't slept that night. They told me we were leaving and that we would go to Six Flags or something to enjoy the rest of their vacations from work. I asked my dad if he was afraid of the monster we saw. All he said to me was, "What monster?" We never talked about it again. My father has passed since, and it is something that he took to his grave. That's why I figured now I could share the story. I get out to hike a lot by myself, but this time out I decided to bring a friend who had never hiked before. He had moved to Vancouver a few months ago and spent a lot of time in the city, and I wanted him to get to know what all we had around us. I decided to take him out hiking at Indian Arm Park, which is about a 2.5-hour drive from Vancouver. We got there on a Saturday afternoon around 1:30 p.m. The weather was perfect, sunny with no wind, and temperatures in the mid-50s. It was also the first weekend of deer hunting season, so we were expecting to see some hunters out there as well as other hikers. We started our hike up the Halvor London Trail, which is a moderate trail. But I didn't want to push my friend too hard since he didn't have much experience. A little over a mile in, he stopped to take a leak to the side of the trail in some bushes. I continued walking ahead for about another 5 or 10 minutes until I reached a small clearing with a few trees and sat down on one of them to take a break and wait for him. Meanwhile, I didn't hear him coming up behind me because he had taken another route back to me through some bushes near where he stopped to pee. He actually startled me when he came up behind me and asked if I wanted some water from his bottle. I was surprised that I didn't hear him, but chalked it up to being more into looking around and listening to all that was around us. Anyway, after a short break, we started up again, but I ended up getting ahead of him because he kept taking pictures with his phone. He's not much of an outdoor guy, and it was all pretty new to him. Maybe 10 minutes later, I noticed a very strong smell of a wet dog. It was so strong that it actually made me want to gag. I stopped and looked around for the source of the smell, but didn't see anything or anyone, just trees and bushes. My friend was starting to catch up, and I was about to say something to him about it when we heard this loud noise coming from the ridge above us on the right-hand side. It sounded like somebody screaming while being strangled at the same time. It was very disturbing. It lasted for about 5 seconds. Then there was a pause of about 10 seconds, and then another scream. I noticed then that the woods were completely silent, which is a red flag because animals are so attuned to danger. So we were obviously freaked out by the screaming and turned around, heading back the way that we had come. I actually had to tell my friend to slow down so he didn't trip and hurt himself or something, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. Maybe that was a hunter who just got a deer, he said, but we both knew that it was something worse. When we finally got near the parking area, another hiker ran up to us from another trail. It looked like he had gone off trail and he was out of breath, having had to trample through some underbrush. My friend asked him if he heard the screaming too. The guy told us that not only had he heard it, but he had seen what was making it. It was some kind of huge animal much bigger than him up on the ridge. We talked for a bit, and it sounded like he had been a little further ahead of us when he saw it. He said we're probably lucky that we all made it out, as he got into his car and drove away. Needless to say, we followed suit and we got ourselves out of there. Also, my friend now has zero interest in hiking and thinks we almost came up on a Bigfoot or some kind of forest-dwelling humanoid. I keep telling him he's spending too much time on conspiracy websites, but I actually think he might be right. And my personal opinion is that we just narrowly missed a really dangerous encounter with one. Whether it was a Bigfoot or whatever, It really doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm still here to tell the tale. Hi, Donovan. This pains me to tell this story, but I feel like I have to, as the anniversary of this event is coming up in August. This happened back in 2013, when a friend of mine and I went hiking for his 55th birthday at Yosemite National Park. We went hiking there every year for his birthday since we both turned 40, and would camp there also. We started out early that morning on the Yosemite Valley Loop Trail. My friend was telling me about his new job that he got working for this company who does managed IT services. He had only been there for 2 weeks, but it seemed like things were going pretty well. When we got to one of the lookout points, my friend wanted to take a selfie to show to his girlfriend. After we took a couple photos, we started back down the loop. The strange thing is there weren't many people there that day. I go to Yosemite quite often and it's always packed, but that day it wasn't. So as we're heading down the trail to return to our camp, my friend steps off the trail to take a leak. This is where things got really weird. I was looking at my cell phone checking my emails when he went to take a leak, but out of the corner of my eye, I see him walk off the trail and just disappear. He didn't go deep into the woods at all, like literally 10 feet off the trail, and I see him just morph into the background. It was the weirdest thing. It was like he stepped through a portal or something. I started freaking out when he wouldn't answer, and I was telling my friend to come back, but he was nowhere to be found. After searching about 30 minutes or so with no signs of him anywhere, I called the park and told them what happened. They had a full-scale search for him and had the sniffer dogs out there too. The scent for him just stopped 10 feet off the trail where he disappeared. They searched for him for 2 weeks before they downgraded the search effort, and no trace of him was ever found. There was coverage about this on a few local news stations, but it never made the national news. I still to this day can't figure out what happened to him or what I really saw that day. I miss him dearly every day, and I wanted to share this story. My cousin and I were out camping solo for the first time since we graduated high school in 2000. We've gone with our families before on big trips, but wanted to get out by ourselves. This was like 2 weeks after graduation, and our parents bought us some new camping gear as a gift. My cousin Jeff was heading to college on the West Coast, so this trip was a big deal. We wouldn't be seeing each other for a while. We decided to go camping in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. It's a remote area, but we had cell service and even Wi-Fi at the campground, so we weren't completely out of touch with civilization. We were camping for 3 days, and it was the first night when all this weird stuff started happening. We were sitting around the campfire and talking about our plans for college and stuff like that. It was getting late, around 10 or 11 p.m., so I started to get sleepy. Jeff was already asleep on his sleeping bag, so I decided to head to my tent and hit the hay. I think I was asleep for maybe about an hour when I woke up to a loud noise outside. It sounded like something heavy falling on the ground, like a rock fell off a cliff or something. Not immediately in the camp, but close. The noise woke up Jeff too, and he barged into the tent pretty quickly asking what happened. I told him about the sound, and we both tried to listen for whatever made the noise, but couldn't hear anything. Then all of a sudden, there was this huge flash of light outside of our tent. It lit up everything inside, and we could see each other clearly. It was super bright. We started freaking out a little bit and thinking this might be lightning struck nearby or something, but there wasn't any thunder or rain. It got really quiet after that flash of light. So we peeked out of the tent and tried to see what happened, but it was too dark outside now. It must have been past midnight by then. Then another bright flash of light struck right above us. Somehow Jeff managed to pass out again, but I was still up, weirded out by the sound and the lights. I sat perfectly still, and not long after started hearing what sounded like rocks being thrown at our tent. They pinged against the fabric, and I could hear them skittering out on the gravel. They couldn't have been bigger than pebbles, but I didn't like the thought that someone or something was targeting us. Whatever it was doing, this stopped after about 10 minutes or so, then left us alone until morning came at 7 a.m. I didn't really sleep that night, instead just dozing and jerking awake pretty often. We packed up our stuff as soon as it got light out because we wanted to get away from whatever messed with us the night before. Jeff wasn't as bothered as I was with the whole thing, but I'm not sure what could have made lights that bright in the area. I kept an eye on the news for a few days, but didn't see reports of any construction or anything like that. Since then, I go camping with larger groups just in case. In July of 2008, I took a week off of work and was camping in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park at the campground called Deep Creek. I was camping alone and staying at the far end of the campground. It was late fall and there were only a few other people camping in the park. The weather had been rainy for several days prior to my encounter. The evening of the encounter was clear and cool with no wind. I had a fire going in my ring and I cooked dinner on it. After dinner, I sat by the fire and read a book until dark. It was between 8 and 9 p.m. when it got dark enough that I couldn't read without using a flashlight. I put out the fire and went to my camper where I brushed my teeth and washed up a little bit, and changing before I returned back to the edge of the woods about 20 feet from my camper. I love having a camper for convenience, but chilly fall nights are my favorite, and I planned to sleep out under the stars in a hammock. I sat there for about 20 minutes at the edge of the woods, just taking in the quiet of the night, when I heard something come from behind me. It sounded like someone walking through dead leaves and twigs snapping as they approached. This was definitely weird since it was really late and I'd be surprised if anyone was walking around the campground. But the rangers usually do rounds, so I was thinking maybe they just wanted to come in a little closer and check in. I sat still and listened. When whatever it was got close enough for me to hear the footsteps crunching on the leaves, I turned around to see what was approaching me and saw 5 people walking single file through some thick brush towards me, coming up from a creek bed which runs along one side of my campsite. Immediately I was on edge as they didn't look like normal campers out for a walk before bed. They all wore dark-colored hooded robes that covered their entire bodies except for their hands, feet, and faces. The robes seemed to be made out of some kind of heavy canvas material with large, deep pockets sewn into them. I half stood up, ready to go back to my camper in case anything weird happened. As these 5 people approached me, I could see that they ranged in age from a young teenager to an older man who looked to be in his 60s. All of them had very pale white skin and seemed to have no body fat on them whatsoever. Even with the big robes, I could tell that they all appeared very gaunt and could make out every rib and vertebrae sticking out of the people closest to me. As these 5 people approached me, I stood up and asked if they needed any help or directions, praying that a ranger would come around soon and interrupt whatever the heck this was. The person closest to me stopped walking when he was about 10 feet away from me, turned around and looked at the others for a moment, but he didn't say anything. As he did this, all 4 people continued walking past him, making a large circle around the edge of the camp before heading back towards the creek bed where they came from. When the last one passed, the person in front of me turned around again and began walking slowly towards me. At this point, he was maybe 20 feet away and moving so sluggishly that a part of me thought I could take him if I had to. When he got within 6 feet of me, I noticed that he was carrying something in his hands, but it was too dark for me to make out what it was. He also appeared quite frail and sickly looking with sunken eyes, cheeks, nose, and forehead. His lips were very dry and cracked, open enough to reveal very small teeth that looked weirdly like they were sharpened. I took a step back at the sight because it was so unusual. How do you even sharpen human teeth? He seemed to sense my unease and looked towards the woods, but the sound of the group moving through the leaves was gone. We were either alone or they were watching. He seemed uneasy for a few moments as he swayed from side to side. I glanced down to see that he had a small knife in his hand, almost like a pocket knife. Immediately, I scrambled back towards the camper, but he held up his hand as if to calm me down. I hesitated, but braced my feet apart and brought my fists up just in case. The kid looked panicked then, like he didn't want to be in this situation. He quickly dropped the knife in the dirt and hurried towards the woods where his friends had disappeared into. I waited a few minutes in silence before moving. Snatching the knife off the ground, I decided to leave my hammock and went straight back for the camper. I had the spot until the next day, but I went into the camper, locked it up, and started it up and got out onto the main road. When I reached a motel about 10 miles away, I felt a little bit better. They assured me that they kept the lights on all night, and I locked both the lock and the deadbolt in my room. When I was finally able to calm down a bit, I checked out the knife. It almost looked like it was handmade and had a weird little carving of a tree at the base of the blade. Definitely rough. After a night of barely sleeping, I went back to the campground the next morning and grabbed the rest of my stuff before checking out early. I don't have the knife anymore. I tossed it out the window somewhere on Route 19. 2 weeks later, I was watching the news and saw that members of this cult were arrested for assaulting people in that same area. When they showed the people on the news, they were the exact same people that I saw that night. My wife and I got married in 2008. And to celebrate, we decided to travel and see some of the national parks before settling down. About a month into our trip, near the end, we were up in Glacier National Park in Montana. We had reserved our campsite almost a year in advance, and the park was pretty busy. So to avoid touristy areas, we decided to hike to Avalanche Lake. This lake is absolutely stunning. It's pretty popular, but we started out really early and we were lucky only to see a handful of other serious hikers along the trail. The trail we took was the Trail of Cedars, about a 6-mile hike. At the time we started, it was about 46 degrees out and clear skies with no wind. We had a light pack since it was only a few miles in and planned to head back to camp and relax after, as it was our last night in Montana. We had made it to the lake around 9 a.m. and had a beautiful view of the stunningly clear water. We found this little side trail that went up to an overlook, and once we got up there, we found an awesome private spot just to chill while we snacked and just took in the views. My wife and I were taking in the silence. We play this game where we stay completely quiet on some sections of the hike to feel more connected with nature, and I heard a light splash. I turned to it quickly, expecting to see a good-sized pike or bass surfacing, but only caught the ripples moving out. I nudged my wife and I pointed. She watched the same spot for a moment, but then when nothing else happened, she looked off in her own direction. Then some movement caught my eye and I looked down and to the left near the shore. There was something just a few yards out in the water. Was it swimming or walking? It was kind of hard to tell. I thought that maybe a moose had come out of the woods and into the water. The only thing that I can really say is that this creature was dark and seemed to stand out against the sunlit water. What in the hell was that? My wife murmured, and I realized she had seen it too. We quietly talked about the possibilities, but within 2 minutes this thing surfaced again, this time further out into the lake. That water has to be freezing, I told my wife. And then I saw this arch of a very long neck. My wife's hand tightened down on my wrist and I held my breath, completely struck by what I was seeing. The water was so clear in this area that we could see the outline of the body beneath, a blurry shadow. It looked exactly like a dinosaur. That sounds crazy, but my 7-year-old nephew was obsessed with dinosaurs at the time, and he'd know the name of whatever this one looked like. We sat there stunned for a moment as it submerged itself and completely disappeared. The lake must have been deeper than we realized because I'm not sure how it could have just vanished from sight. My wife finally started moving around and seemed excited. "Did we just see Nessie?" she said. It seemed ludicrous, but I'm not sure what the other explanation would be. In a weird way, I can see how it makes sense. A lot of these cold lakes up north are secluded, and a huge creature, even a dinosaur, could probably sustain itself and stay out of sight if it was smart enough for self-preservation. We stayed almost another 2 hours but didn't see anything else. A good amount of hikers finally started pouring into the area and we decided to head back. We still talk about this once in a while but have no real answer for what it was. Either way, it was a really cool experience and a perfect honeymoon. Hi Donovan. I listen to your stories when I'm out on patrol. It makes the night shift go a lot quicker. I was working the night shift one evening and got a call about a disturbance at an old abandoned house on the outskirts of town. I was the only one available, so I took the call. When I arrived, I could see why it was abandoned. It looked like it had been burned down at some point and then left to rot. The windows were all boarded up and there was graffiti everywhere. Local kids love coming out to houses like this and partying, so I figured I just had to scare off some local teens. As I approached, I could hear someone inside yelling and smashing things. I decided to enter the house, and as soon as I did, the temperature dropped, and I got a feeling like somebody was watching me. I called out for the person causing the disturbance, but there was no answer. I started to feel really uneasy, so I decided to head back out and call for backup and wait. As I turned to leave, I saw this figure out of the corner of my eye. When I turned to look, there was nothing there. I chalked it up to nerves and went back to my car and waited for backup. About 10 minutes later, 2 other officers arrived and we went back into the house. We searched every room but didn't find anyone. There was no sign of forced entry or anything that would explain how someone got in. We did find a lot of broken furniture and dishes, but nothing else. Weirdly, the feeling I had when I first entered the house came back. It was like someone was watching us. We searched the house a second time, but I still didn't find anything. As we were about to leave, one of the officers said he saw a figure in the upstairs window. We went outside to look, but there was no one there. Weird things like this happen sometimes on calls, so we didn't think much of it. But ever since that night, I can't shake the feeling that something strange is going on in that house. I'm definitely not going back there anytime soon on my own. But whatever was out there wasn't a human. We checked every corner and closet, and there's no way it could have avoided us. Hi Donovan, I appreciate all the content. This took place in Carlsbad back when I was still on the force, and made a career change to go in IT. It's much calmer and usually not as weird. Carlsbad is known for the caverns and gets a lot of people traveling in and out, so the police out that way are used to getting calls, usually to check on partying or sketchy behavior. It was late and I had been cruising around for a while. Around 2 a.m. I get a call from dispatch. They've got someone reporting a large dog stalking someone on the east side of town. They're asking me to check it out. Sure enough, I find a guy walking down the very middle of the road like he's trying to stay in the streetlights. And when my headlights swing out behind him, I see the thing following him. It looks like a dog at first, and it's walking towards the guy with its head down between its shoulders. I pull up, unlock the doors, and tell him to get in. He does, shaking and locking the door behind him. I'm heading home from the bar, he says. I believe him because I can smell the beer on him. He starts to tell me about how this dog came out of this rundown trailer yard and started stalking him, not going away even when he threw rocks at it. That seems pretty extreme, so I pull a U-turn and head back to see if this thing is still hanging around. Sure enough, it's still walking along the side of the road, totally unafraid of the passing traffic. I grew up with rescue dogs, so the first thing I blurt out is, "Oh, that's just a dog with mange." But as we get closer and the headlights hit it dead on, I realize that it looks more like a hyena than a regular dog, with a rigid spine and almost no hair. The guy is breathing hard and freaking out a bit, so I decide to call it into animal control and get him home. We're only a few minutes away from where he lives, so as soon as I drop him off, I turn around and head back to see if they found it and caught it. I get back to the area and see a truck from animal control parked on the side of the road. I pull up and head over there, but when I start to walk around to the truck, I realize there's no one there. It takes me a few minutes to see the flashlight shining down the road, and I realize that there are some fellow officers of mine at the scene. When I finally find them, there's 2 officers and they both look spooked. One of them, Mario, who I work with on shift regularly, told me that they saw a dog creature as soon as they arrived. It was still trotting down the road in the direction I brought the guy home, almost like it was coming after us, which sounds crazy. But when they cut the creature off and got out of the van, it turned and ran for the trailer park. They managed to follow it for a while before it ducked through a gap in a fence and disappeared. I spent 2 more years as an officer, usually running the night shift. Every time I drove that area, I checked the roads and pull-offs to see if it would show up again. I didn't really want to come across that thing again since everything in me says it wasn't just a stray dog. But part of me wanted to get another look at it. That long, sharp snout and weirdly rigid spine really freaked me out. Animal control never caught it, so it must still be out there somewhere. Hey Donovan, I don't live in Pennsylvania, but my friends and I often travel down there in the summer to go camping a few times a year. We get maybe 5 or 6 of us together, head out to a campground or a secluded area, and spend a few days just bumming around. The year this happened, we decided to check out Bald Eagle State Park, which is close to a lot of attractions, a creek and some cool areas to explore. This time around, there were 5 of us in total. We were camping in a small rustic tent area not too far from the lake. It was late in the night when we arrived, and we all started setting up our tents and getting out our gear. I was with my girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife. So we set up our tent near the back of the area by ourselves for some privacy. The rest of our friends were about 10 or 15 feet away and spread out into another campsite. We were close to a small rise, and it was dark enough that you couldn't see past maybe 20 feet in front of you without some light from your flashlight or a fire. That's where things started to get a little weird. My girlfriend and I couldn't sleep, and we were talking for about an hour before we heard something that sounded like wings beating. Whatever it was sounded huge, and we turned to each other completely silent and on edge. The sound died down quickly, and she whispered, "That was probably an owl, right?" But I was thinking about how owls fly silently so they can surprise their prey. I was pretty sure it wasn't an owl, but I didn't want to freak her out. I opened my mouth, but then we heard it again. I grabbed my flashlight and, propping myself up, shined it into the woods through the tent flap. I aimed high into the trees. My girlfriend scrunched up her nose and whispered that she could smell something awful, thick and musty. Then, suddenly, I saw something fly up into the trees. It was black and it had wings that were at least 5 feet across from tip to tip, but they weren't feathered wings. They had more of a rounded shape to them before it disappeared into the shadows, and I couldn't see any other details because it was dark. But it looked like a giant moth or a bat. My heart started racing and I fell back a bit. My girlfriend had to seen it too, and was frantically texting our friends in the next tent. In the tent next to us was a good friend of mine, and he came out of his tent and yelled for a while and waved around his flashlight. But nothing moved in the trees again. He came back to check on us, and we told him we were okay. That night, neither of us slept very much at all. We told everyone else what happened the next day when they saw us looking around in the wooded area, and they laughed it off, saying it was probably just an owl or a vulture or something normal that we'd never seen before. But whatever it was freaked us out so much that we just decided to stay at this bed and breakfast nearby, using the excuse that we wanted some alone time. That's the last time that my girlfriend and I ever went camping with that group. Hi Donovan. This happened back in 2015 when I was just starting my junior year of college. I finally managed to balance my schedule in a way that got me out of class at 10 a.m. on Fridays. So I was able to camp for a few days at a time. I also lived and was going to college in New England, a great place for outdoor recreation. In the winter of 2012, my friend and I decided to camp out in a yurt that we Airbnb'd. But my friend dropped out at the last minute because he had some makeup work to do. I ended up having to go alone, which was fine with me as I was very comfortable camping on my own. I left Friday morning and drove up to the yurt, which was about a 2-hour drive from where I lived in northwestern Connecticut. The yurt is about 40 minutes to the closest town and is pretty secluded with only a few other houses around it. As I got closer, my GPS kept cutting out and the roads weren't great. But I was driving a Subaru at the time and able to scramble up some iffy turns near the mountains. The first night went great. I had a campfire going and cooked some dinner, then sat back with my book and watched the stars come out as it got darker. It was very peaceful, but when you're alone in nature, you can start to hear things that aren't there, like coyotes howling in the distance or owls hooting off in the woods. It was around this time that I started to hear something different. Not exactly howling or hooting, but more of a deep moaning sound. It would go on for about maybe 10 seconds before stopping abruptly. Then 5 seconds later, it would do it again. This went on for maybe 30 minutes before it finally stopped completely. Maybe it was just an owl calling across the valley, or maybe a deer. Whatever it was made me uneasy enough that after another 30 minutes of staring into the fire, I decided it was time to go to bed. I set up my tent and crawled inside and zipped myself in for the night. I was maybe a little more jumpy than usual with all of the weird sounds, but eventually I ended up falling asleep. Just after midnight, I woke up to the sound of something not too far from the tent. There was the sound of twigs snapping, but louder, which seemed crazy. I carefully moved over to the little plastic window in the yurt and squinted, trying to see what was going on by moonlight. The fire was still dying down too, so the glow of the embers lit up the immediate area about 20 feet from the yurt. I happened to glance at the ground and froze. There were footprints around the far edge of the fire pit, but they were massive, easily too big to be human. My Subaru was close by and I tried to calculate how quickly I could get to it, because something was still crunching around at the edge of the trees behind the yurt. My heart was pounding, and I was hoping that whatever it was slow. Quickly, trying not to panic, I packed up the one bag I'd brought and decided at the last second to forget about the cookware I left near the fire pit. Right near the flap of the yurt, I held my breath and I listened. I could hear kind of a panting back in the woods. Maybe it was a bear, but it still seemed weird that it would linger so close to a camp, especially since I hadn't left any food or anything attractive out. I waited until a branch snapped, hoping that whatever it was distracted, and bolted from the yurt, clicking my car keys desperately. I threw open the door and tossed in my bag, locking up as soon as I was able to, and started the car. I didn't even put my seatbelt on and practically tumbled down the little mountain I was camped on. At that point, it seemed like I was home free. I breathed a little easier on a sturdier dirt road and watched carefully for any signs of deer, as there are a lot in the area. I couldn't have gone more than a few miles when all of a sudden it was right there in front of my car. Something out of a nightmare. This thing was easily 9 or 10 feet tall and gaunt. I mean, it looked starved, slightly hunched over, and all I could see were its ribs. It was hard to believe it was alive. I shouted and pulled my car over to the right. Luckily, there just happened to be a gravel shoulder that I skidded across, barely avoiding the thing. I was breathing heavy again and practically paralyzed with fear, but happened to glance in the rearview mirror. Whatever it was hadn't moved, and was watching as I drove away. It was then I realized there was a gross smell in the air, like something was decaying. I was pretty freaked out the rest of the week and unable to focus in class. One of my teachers noticed and asked what was up. The story finally spilled out of me, and he just froze for a moment, wide-eyed. This teacher is half Native American and teaches some Native courses on campus. After I practically begged him to tell me what the creature was I saw, he pointed me in the direction of some reading. I started reading these stories that all pointed to this thing called a Wendigo. I don't know if I believed that something was after me that night, but I can tell you that whatever it was looked exactly like how Wendigos are described in Native legends. Safe to say that now I don't go camping alone anymore.